My name is Sloane. I am 33 years old, and my mother-in-law pushed me off a hotel terrace to protect a $50 million trust fund. As I lay bleeding on the marble patio, my husband stood by and watched. Hours later in the emergency room, he told the police I was mentally unstable and had jumped. They thought they had eliminated me and my unborn child to keep their secrets safe. 6 months later, my forensic audit of their lives destroyed their entire empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to use cold, hard facts to destroy a toxic family member. A fake pregnancy to unlock my son's $50 million trust. Do you honestly think this family is stupid enough to fall for a printed ultrasound you bought online? The words sliced through the ambient jazz of the Waldorf rooftop restaurant. My mother-in-law Camilla did not yell. She did not have to. Her cold, aristocratic voice carried perfectly over the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. She picked up the glossy sonogram photo I had just placed on the linen tablecloth and flicked it back at me. It landed perfectly in my untouched lobster bisque. "Mother, please keep your voice down," Bennett muttered. He nervously adjusted his silk tie and refused to look at me. My husband of 4 years, a man whose spine was apparently made of the same expensive cashmere as his sweater, stared intently at his fork. Growing up, I learned to identify cowards easily, but Bennett was a special breed. He was the heir to a massive New York real estate fortune, yet he folded like cheap paper whenever his mother spoke. "I will not keep my voice down, Bennett," Camilla sneered. Her diamond earrings caught the city lights as she leaned forward. "Your wife is a forensic auditor. She manipulates numbers for a living. You do not think she knows exactly how your grandfather's trust is structured. The stipulation is crystal clear. The 50 million unlocks the day you produce a biological heir. She is trying to secure a payday before you finally file the divorce papers I told you to draft." "There are no divorce papers," I said. My voice was eerily calm, despite the tremor in my hands. I carefully reached into the bowl, pulled out the ruined ultrasound, and wiped the soup off the glossy paper. "And this is your grandson. I am 12 weeks along with a strong heartbeat." Lies, Camilla spat. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Come with me to the terrace, Sloane. Now! Unless you want me to call security and have them escort you out for attempting to defraud our estate." I stood up and adjusted my tailored blazer. I did not fear her. I walked past the staring elite of Manhattan, stepping out onto the private garden terrace. The November wind was biting, whipping my hair across my face. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind us, muting the restaurant noise. "You listen to me," Camilla hissed. She dropped the polished society matriarch act instantly. "I know your game. You grew up with nothing. You saw Bennett as a walking bank account. But I manage that trust. I control the purse strings, and no gold-digging auditor is going to waltz in with a fake belly and steal my leverage." "Your leverage?" I asked. My professional instincts flared. "It is Bennett's money, Camilla, not yours. Unless there is a reason you do not want the federal bank conducting the mandatory audit that triggers when an heir is born." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. It was the micro-expression of a cornered animal. In my line of work investigating corporate fraud, I had seen chief executive officers make that exact face right before I uncovered their offshore accounts. I had hit a nerve, a massive one. "You have no idea what you are dealing with," she whispered. Her voice trembled with raw, unfiltered panic. Before I could process the sudden shift in her demeanor, Camilla lunged. She did not slap me. She did not grab my arm. She planted both of her hands squarely on my chest and shoved with a desperate, terrifying force. The low stone balustrade hit the back of my knees. My center of gravity shifted instantly. I grabbed frantically at the air, my fingers brushing the cold silk of her blouse, but there was nothing to hold on to. The city lights blurred into a violent streak of yellow and white. I fell. It was only one story down to the lower VIP patio, but the impact was devastating. I hit the decorative hedges first. Branches snapped, sending me crashing onto the marble tiles. A blinding explosion of pain ripped through my pelvis and spine. I gasped, unable to pull air into my lungs. The world faded into a dizzying static. Through the haze of agony, I heard screams from the diners above. Then came the sharp, authoritative click of Camilla's designer heels rapidly descending the exterior wrought iron stairs. She knelt beside me. Her face was a mask of perfectly manufactured horror. Oh my God. Somebody call an ambulance. My daughter-in-law. She slipped. I tried to catch her, but she just slipped. I tried to speak. I wanted to scream to the gathering crowd that she had pushed me, but my mouth only tasted of copper. The darkness rushed in, swallowing the panic around me. When I finally opened my eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room blinded me. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor was the only sound grounding me to reality. I tried to move my legs, but a heavy numbness anchored my lower half. Pure panic surged through my veins. My hands immediately flew to my stomach, searching for any sign of my baby. "The patient is awake," a nurse called out, rushing to my side. Before I could ask about my child, the heavy wooden door swung open. Camilla walked in. She was dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. Right behind her walked two uniformed police officers, followed closely by Bennett. The ultimate betrayal was about to unfold right in front of me. "Officers, thank God she is awake," Camilla said. Her voice was shaking with fake trauma. "As I told you, Sloane has been deeply unwell. She has had severe psychological episodes since her father passed away last year. She was confused tonight, claiming she was pregnant, which is biologically impossible, as my son can attest. She was highly agitated and just stumbled backward over the railing." I stared at her. The sheer audacity of the lie temporarily paralyzed my vocal cords. She was weaponizing my grief over my father to paint me as a hysterical woman. "Is this true, Ma?" and one of the officers asked. He looked down at me with a mixture of pity and skepticism. "Did you slip?" "She pushed me," I croaked. My throat was completely raw. Camilla let out a tragic, dramatic sigh. "Oh, Sloane, still delusional." She turned to Bennett and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Tell them, darling. Tell them about her condition." I looked at my husband, desperately waiting for him to do the right thing, to defend the woman he married. But Bennett refused to meet my eyes. He stared firmly at the cheap linoleum floor, his jaw tight. "She has been under a lot of stress," Bennett mumbled. "Imagining things. She is not pregnant." My own husband, the man I had shared a bed with for 4 years, was throwing me to the wolves just to protect his mother. The betrayal was a physical blow, far sharper than the impact of the marble patio. He knew I was pregnant. He had seen the positive tests. Yet here he was, confirming her lies to the police. "Officers, we will handle her psychiatric care from here," Camilla said smoothly, stepping between the bed and the police. "She is clearly a danger to herself, and we are arranging for private medical transport to our estate where she can be properly monitored." The officers exchanged a look, scribbled some notes, and nodded. "It is a family matter, then. We will file the report as an accidental fall due to distress." They turned and walked out of the room, completely dismissing my words as the ramblings of a crazy woman. The moment the door clicked shut, the performance ended. Camilla's faux sympathy vanished instantly. She stood at the foot of my hospital bed, her posture rigid and triumphant. A cold, victorious smile spread across her face. "You really thought you could outsmart me, Sloane," she whispered maliciously. "You thought a baby would secure your place in this family. Now look at you, broken and completely alone." Bennett finally looked up, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. "I am sorry, Sloane," he said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. He dropped the papers onto my blanket. "Mother is right. You have gone too far. Sign the divorce papers. The trust will cover your medical bills. Let us just end this quietly." I looked down at the bold black letters on the document. Petition for dissolution of marriage. They had planned this. They wanted to erase me completely. Before I could unleash the absolute fury building inside me, the attending trauma surgeon pushed into the room. He looked at Camilla and Bennett with a stern, uncompromising expression. "I need everyone to clear the room immediately," the doctor ordered. "I have to discuss the patient's medical status with her privately. I am her mother-in-law, and this is her husband." Camilla bristled, her eyes flashing with anger. "We have a legal right to stay. Hospital policy, the doctor replied coldly, holding the door open. Out, now. Reluctantly, Camilla grabbed Bennett's arm and marched out, leaving me alone with the doctor. The moment the door closed, I knew everything was about to change. My mind, usually focused on spreadsheets and financial audits, shifted gears. I was no longer just a wife trying to fit into a wealthy family. I was a forensic auditor who had just been handed a puzzle with missing pieces, and I was going to tear their entire world apart to find the truth. Dr. Evans stood by the door for a long moment, ensuring the lock had engaged with a firm click. He turned back to me, his expression grave. He stepped closer to the bed, lowering his voice to a whisper that barely carried over the hum of the medical equipment. Sloane, I need you to listen to me very carefully, he said. I saw the ultrasound in your purse when you were brought in. I ran the blood tests myself. My heart stopped. I braced myself for the words I dreaded most, the confirmation that Camilla's violent shove had stolen my child. There was a severe placental abruption. Dr. Evans continued, his eyes locked on mine. You were bleeding internally when the paramedics arrived. We had to perform emergency surgery the second you hit the operating table. But Sloane, your baby survived the fall. The monitors beside my bed spiked wildly. A raw, choked gasp escaped my throat. Tears of absolute relief spilled down my cheeks, stinging my skin. Is he okay? I begged, my voice breaking. Please tell me he is okay. He was born extremely premature, Dr. Evans explained gently. He is fighting hard. Right now, he is in our top-secret neonatal intensive care unit on a different floor. Only a select few nurses even know he is there. But given what I just heard your family say to those police officers, I made an executive decision. He pulled a tablet from his coat and showed me the screen. I have officially listed your chart as a traumatic miscarriage, resulting from an accidental fall. If your mother-in-law and your husband want you out of the picture this badly, they cannot know this child exists. Not until he is strong enough to leave this hospital. I do not trust them, and frankly, neither should you. Neither should. I stared at the doctor, overwhelmed by his courage. He was risking his medical license to protect a patient he had just met. I nodded, gripping the cold metal bed rails. The forensic auditor inside me took full control. Emotions shut down. Strategy engaged. I knew exactly how wealthy families operated. They bought silence. They bought police reports. They bought people. If Camilla found out my son was alive, she would use Bennett's endless resources to rip him away from me in family court, or worse, ensure he never made it out of the neonatal unit at all. Thank you, I whispered fiercely. Do not tell anyone else. Let them think they won. Dr. Evans gave a curt nod. I will be the only physician managing your chart. Get some rest, Sloane. You have a war ahead of you. He unlocked the door and slipped out of the room. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of the secret I now carried. I closed my eyes, trying to process the pain radiating through my fractured pelvis, but my mind was already racing miles ahead. Why did Camilla push me? She hated me, yes, but she was obsessed with public image. Attempted murder in a crowded Manhattan restaurant was sloppy. It was desperate. People only took desperate risks when they were cornered. It had to be about the trust fund. It was always about the money. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. I tensed, expecting Camilla to march back in to demand my signature on the divorce papers Bennett had discarded on my bed. Instead, the door cracked open just enough for a tall figure to slip inside. The door shut quickly, and the deadbolt slid into place. It was Trey. Trey was my sister-in-law's husband, a brilliant corporate attorney, and the only black man in this suffocating, elitist family. He had always been an outsider, much like me, silently navigating their racist microaggressions and condescending remarks. We shared a mutual unspoken understanding that the family we married into was toxic to its core. But I had never expected him to walk into my hospital room right now. He did not offer empty condolences. He did not ask how I was feeling. He stepped up to the bed, his dark eyes burning with an intense, lethal focus. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small silver USB drive. He placed it firmly in the palm of my hand and closed my fingers around it. The Waldorf has a blind spot camera on the upper terrace, Trey whispered, glancing toward the frosted glass of the hospital door. Camilla paid the hotel manager 100 grand in cash to wipe the servers. But I got to the security guard first. I have the footage, Sloan. I have it all. I clutched the drive. Its cold metal edge bit into my palm, but it felt like a lifeline. Trey, I breathed, staring at him in disbelief. Do you understand what you are risking? If Camilla finds out you have this, she will destroy your career. She will force Kelsey to leave you. Trey let out a low, bitter scoff. He leaned closer, resting his hands on the foot of my bed. Let her try. I have spent 5 years watching that woman treat you like dirt, while Bennett stands by like a coward. I have spent 5 years biting my tongue while they make passive-aggressive comments about my background. I am done playing their game. When I heard she pushed you, I knew I had to move faster than her checkbook. He pointed a finger at the USB drive in my hand. Hide it, keep it safe. Camilla is currently downstairs arranging your medical transfer. She told the hospital staff she hired a private care team for your psychiatric recovery. In reality, she is taking you to the Connecticut estate. She is locking you down so you cannot speak to the press or hire an independent lawyer. I know, I replied, my voice raspy but steady. She needs to control the narrative. If I am isolated in the mansion, she controls who I see and what I say. Play the victim, Trey advised sharply. Let her think the fall broke your spirit. Let Bennett think you are grieving the miscarriage. Do not fight back yet. I will handle the legal back end quietly. When you figure out why she really pushed you, let me know. We strike when the iron is hot. I looked at Trey. He was a senior partner at a prestigious Manhattan law firm. He had worked his entire life to get to where he was, overcoming systemic hurdles this family could never even fathom. Marrying Kelsey was supposed to be his integration into the upper echelon of society, but I knew the ugly reality of his daily life. Camilla introduced him at charity galas as her diverse son-in-law, parading him around like a corporate trophy to prove how progressive the family was. Yet she simultaneously made sure he never gained access to the core family accounts or voting rights on the estate board. Behind closed doors, they criticized his legal assertiveness as aggression. They questioned his background with thinly veiled polite insults. He despised their racist, elitist undertones just as much as I despised their arrogance. We were the two outsiders brought in to serve a purpose and expected to remain silent. You are risking your entire career and your marriage, I said, my voice barely a whisper so it would not carry into the hallway. Kelsey worships her mother. If she finds out you went behind Camilla's back to steal hotel security footage, she will leave you and take your daughter. Trey scoffed, adjusting his pristine cufflinks with absolute composure. If my wife chooses a murderer over her husband, then the marriage was dead anyway. I refuse to let that woman win. I refuse to let my daughter grow up thinking this toxic behavior is normal. Keep the drive hidden. Camilla already has her expensive fixers scrubbing the hospital records and threatening the hotel staff. He stepped closer to the bed, his tone shifting into pure, unadulterated legal strategy. You need to understand exactly what happens next, Sloan. Camilla is not just moving you to the Connecticut estate to keep you comfortable. She is establishing a legal perimeter. By labeling this a psychiatric transfer following a trauma, she is legally positioning herself as your primary caretaker. Once you are behind those wrought iron gates, you will have no phone, no internet access, and absolutely no contact with the outside world. It is a golden cage. She wants to isolate you so completely that you will sign whatever divorce papers she puts in front of you just to taste freedom again. I nodded slowly, the chilling reality of my situation settling deep into my bones. I knew the Connecticut property well. It was a sprawling 20-acre compound surrounded by 10-foot fences and patrolled around the clock by private security. It was completely impenetrable from the outside, but I was about to be safely secured on the inside. Let them take me, I said, my mind calculating the variables. I will not fight them. If I scream and resist the transport, it only proves her fabricated story to the police about my mental instability. I need you to hold on to this drive. I pressed the silver USB back into his large palm, wrapping his fingers around it. I cannot take it with me. They will search my belongings. They will strip me of everything the moment I arrive to ensure I have no contraband. Keep the footage safe. Build the case against her from the outside. I will find the financial rot from the inside. Trey looked at the drive, then gave a firm nod, slipping it securely into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. We are in this together now, he whispered. A heavy authoritative knock echoed against the door. We both froze. The lock clicked and a key turned from the outside. Camilla had already managed to bypass the doctor's strict orders by bribing a hospital administrator. The heavy door swung open, revealing my mother-in-law flanked by two burly men in dark blue medical scrubs. They did not look like standard hospital staff. They looked like expensive private muscle hired to handle difficult assets. Bennett hovered nervously behind them in the hallway, his eyes darting anywhere but at me. It was time to play my part. I let my shoulders slump forward. I relaxed the muscles in my face, letting my expression go completely vacant and hollow. I stared blankly at the far wall, channeling every ounce of genuine physical pain and emotional exhaustion I felt into a mask of total crushing defeat. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, not for the baby they thought I lost, but for the absolute war I was about to wage against them. Ah, Camilla said smoothly as she stepped into the room. Her sharp eyes flicked suspiciously between us, searching for any sign of conspiracy. How kind of you to check on her. But we have a private transport team ready now. Sloane needs rest in a highly secure environment. Trey stepped back, slipping seamlessly into his role as the concerned, helpless relative. Of course, Camilla. I was just offering my condolences. She seems completely out of it. She has not spoken a word. It is tragic. Camilla smiled a thin, predatory smile that chilled the room. Yes, utterly tragic. The men in scrubs moved forward instantly. They did not ask for my consent. They efficiently lifted me from the hospital bed and placed me onto a portable stretcher, strapping me in tightly. I did not speak. I did not struggle. I let my head loll to the side. As they wheeled me past Bennett, he reached out and awkwardly patted my shoulder. You will be safe at home, Sloane, he muttered weakly. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I was heading straight into the lion's den, but they had no idea I was the one bringing the fire. The journey to Connecticut was a blur of highway lights and the silent hum of the luxury medical transport. When we arrived at the estate, the heavy iron gates closed behind us with a finality that would have terrified a normal person. The medical team carried me up two grand staircases to a secluded guest suite on the third floor. It was a beautiful room decorated in suffocating floral prints and antique mahogany, but it was designed to be a cell. The moment the guards left, Camilla came in. She did not bring water or pain medication. She brought a silver tray to collect my belongings. She took my purse, my keys, and my phone, citing the doctor's orders for zero outside stimulation. When I asked for the Wi-Fi password to watch a movie on the smart television, she smiled sweetly and informed me the network was secured with a biometric thumbprint scan. Only family members were registered. And since I was practically an ex-wife, I did not qualify. For the next 4 days, my existence was a carefully orchestrated psychological torment. The private nurses only spoke when dispensing medication. My meals were brought up on trays, and every afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, Camilla would unlock my door for her daily visit. She did not come to check on my healing pelvis. She came to twist the knife. She would stand at the foot of my bed, sipping tea from a bone china cup, and detail exactly how much of a failure I was. You really thought you could trap him, she said on the second day. Bennett is already meeting with his lawyers to expedite the divorce. He realizes now that you were nothing but a temporary distraction. On the third day, she brought up the baby. It is almost poetic, she mused, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. The universe correcting a mistake. A child with your pedigree never belonged in this lineage anyway. Bennett never visited. He was too cowardly to face the woman he had abandoned, leaving his mother to do the dirty work. Every word was designed to break me down, to make me so desperate for an escape that I would sign the divorce papers just to get out of that room. But she underestimated my discipline. I refused to give her a single tear. I stared blankly out the window, adopting the deadened eyes of a woman who had lost everything. I let her talk. I let her feel victorious. Because while she was gloating, I was memorizing the patrol schedules of the private security guards outside my window. I was counting the minutes between the nurses' rounds. By the fourth night, I knew their routine perfectly. The house staff retired at midnight. The night nurse checked my vitals at 1 in the morning, then went to the kitchen on the first floor to read her magazines. At 2 in the morning, the mansion was a fortress of absolute silence. I threw off the heavy duvet. A sharp shooting pain radiated from my fractured pelvis up through my spine, forcing a silent gasp from my lungs. I bit down hard on my lower lip, tasting blood, and forced myself to stand. I could not let the pain stop me. My son was fighting for his life in a plastic incubator miles away, and I was going to secure his future tonight. I slipped out of the room, leaving the door unlatched so the lock would not click. The hallway was pitched in darkness, illuminated only by the faint moonlight spilling through the arched windows. I moved at an agonizingly slow pace, favoring my uninjured side, carefully avoiding the creaking floorboards near the grand staircase. I descended to the second floor, navigating the labyrinth of velvet runners and marble statues, until I reached the west wing. Bennett's home office was at the end of the hall. He was a creature of immense privilege and predictable laziness. He never locked his doors because he believed the entire world belonged to him. I turned the brass knob and slipped inside, shutting the heavy oak door behind me without a sound. The room smelled of expensive scotch and leather. I limped over to the massive mahogany desk. Sitting right in the center, plugged into its charger, was his work laptop. I needed to access the family financial servers, and this laptop was the only device in the house already authenticated on the biometric network. I opened the lid. The screen flared to life, illuminating my face in the dark room. A password prompt blinked mockingly on the screen. Camilla paid thousands of dollars for top-tier network security for the estate, but she could not buy a work ethic for her son. Bennett used the exact same password for everything since we were dating. I did not need a hacking program. I simply typed the name of his childhood golden retriever followed by his birth year, Barnaby, 88. I hit the enter key. The screen unlocked instantly, dropping me directly onto his desktop. I was in. The glow of the monitor cast long shadows across the dark mahogany walls of the office. I did not waste a single second celebrating my easy access. I knew Camilla paid a premium for a private IT administrator who monitored the estate network traffic in real time. If I simply opened a web browser and navigated to the family banking portal, an alert would flag my activity on the administrator's dashboard by morning. I needed to become a ghost in their machine. I opened the command terminal on Bennett's laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory taking over. I used my federal forensic auditing credentials to tunnel into a secure proxy server located in a server farm in Iceland. I routed Bennett's connection through an encrypted virtual private network shell, effectively masking my digital footprint. To the estate, IT administrator Bennett's laptop would appear completely dormant, fast asleep on its charging dock. With my connection secured, I opened a private browser window and navigated directly to the Vanguard Wealth Management portal. Bennett was notoriously lazy with his digital security. As I suspected, his browser had saved the master login credentials. When the system prompted for a two-factor authentication code, I simply opened a new tab, accessed his already logged-in email account, and retrieved the 6-digit PIN. He made it almost too easy. The portal loaded, displaying a dashboard of staggering wealth. My eyes immediately locked onto the primary account, the Grandfather Trust. I clicked into the folder, bringing up the master stipulations of the $50 million fund. I read through the dense legal jargon, confirming what I already knew from my career in financial forensics. Bennett's grandfather had structured the trust with an ironclad contingency. The principal $50 million was untouchable. Bennett received a generous monthly allowance, but the core fortune remained locked under Camilla's control as the sole trustee. The trust was designed to dissolve and transfer entirely into Bennett's name the exact moment he produced a biological heir. It was an old money tradition to ensure the next generation was financially secured before handing over the keys to the kingdom. But there was a catch, a massive, unavoidable legal catch. According to federal banking regulations, the dissolution of a trust of this magnitude automatically triggered a comprehensive federally mandated bank audit. Before the institution could legally transfer the $50 million to Bennett, an independent federal auditor had to comb through a decade of Camilla's financial management. They had to verify every investment, every withdrawal, and every tax filing to ensure the trustee had not mismanaged the beneficiary's assets. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. To an untrained eye, the main dashboard looked perfectly healthy. The digital readout proudly displayed a total asset value of just over $50 million, diversified across various mutual funds and real estate holdings. But I was not an untrained eye. I knew that front-end dashboards were easily manipulated to show projected values rather than liquid reality. I needed the raw data. I bypassed the user interface and downloaded the back-end ledger files for the past 10 years. Thousands of rows of data flooded my screen in a dense spreadsheet. I opened a custom algorithm script I had written for my federal fraud investigations. I set the parameters to cross-reference all reported capital gains against offshore wire transfers and phantom loan originations. I executed the script. The laptop fan whirred softly as the processor churned through a decade of Camilla's financial history. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen. I thought about the cold, calculated look in Camilla's eyes right before she shoved me over the stone balustrade. I thought about how quickly she had lied to the police, painting me as a hysterical, grieving woman. I thought about the divorce papers Bennett had dropped on my hospital bed, desperate to sever my legal ties to the family. They were not trying to get rid of me because I was from a lower social class. They were trying to stop the clock. The algorithm chimed softly, indicating the analysis was complete. A new spreadsheet populated on the screen, highlighting the discrepancies in glaring red text. My breath caught in my throat. The numbers stared back at me, revealing a truth so horrifying it made my blood run cold. There were dozens of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. There were massive unrecorded capital withdrawals categorized under obscure administrative fees. Camilla had not been managing the trust. She had been bleeding it dry to fund her lavish lifestyle and cover catastrophic investment failures. I looked at the final calculated total at the bottom of the screen. The $50 million was a mirage. $48 million of the trust was completely gone. I sat frozen in the glow of the monitor. My eyes scanned the lines of data again and again, but the math did not lie. $48 million. Erased. I needed to know exactly where it went. I clicked on the largest withdrawal, a $7 million transfer labeled as a strategic real estate investment. I traced the routing numbers through the international banking portal. The money had not gone to a property developer. It was wired directly to a phantom limited liability company, registered to a post office box in the Cayman Islands. I ran a secondary search on the offshore account. The web of deceit began to unravel before my eyes. The Cayman account was merely a funnel. From there, the funds were dispersed in smaller, untraceable increments to private banking institutions in Macau, Monaco, and Las Vegas. These were not investments. They were markers. Camilla was not just a society matriarch with a taste for expensive art and designer clothes. She was a high-stakes gambler. She had been quietly bleeding her son's inheritance dry to cover catastrophic losses at international baccarat tables. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was staggering. For 10 years, she had forged tax documents, falsified quarterly earnings reports, and manipulated the trust ledger to make it appear whole. She had built a house of cards resting entirely on one crucial condition. Bennett could never have a child. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air in the office suddenly felt thin. I closed my eyes, and the memory of the Waldorf terrace rushed back. The cold wind, the look of absolute calculated panic on Camilla's face when I mentioned the federal bank audit, the terrifying strength she used to shove me backward over the stone balustrade. She did not push me because she hated my working-class background. She did not push me because she thought I was a gold digger trying to trap her son. She pushed me because my unborn child was the key that would unlock the vault. The moment my son took his first breath, the trust would legally dissolve. The banking institution would automatically dispatch federal auditors to review the accounts before releasing the funds to Bennett. They would look at the exact same ledgers I was looking at right now. They would find the missing $48 million, the Cayman shell companies, and the forged documents. Camilla would lose her social standing, her mansion, and her freedom. She would face decades in federal prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. My baby was not just an inconvenience. My baby was a prison sentence. Pushing me off that terrace was not an act of spontaneous rage. It was a calculated, premeditated attempt to commit financial murder. She tried to kill me and my unborn child to balance her books. A cold, dangerous calm washed over me. The pain in my fractured pelvis faded into the background, replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline. I was no longer a victim trapped in a gilded cage. I was the architect of her destruction. But to build the gallows, I needed the wood. I needed the data. I unclasped my smartwatch. When Camilla's private security team had confiscated my phone and belongings, they had ignored the watch, assuming it was a useless piece of jewelry without a paired network connection. They did not know that the underside of the casing held a hidden compartment. I pressed the tiny release valve with my fingernail, sliding out a microscopic SD card. I inserted the card into the side port of Bennett's laptop. I highlighted the entire decade of fraudulent ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the results of my forensic algorithm. I initiated the transfer. A small progress bar appeared on the screen. 20%, 40%. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, willing the data to move faster. Every byte of information was a nail in Camilla's coffin. 60%, 80%. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the mansion was broken. A heavy, rhythmic sound echoed from the grand staircase down the hall. Footsteps. Someone was walking on the second floor. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving directly toward the west wing, toward the office. 90%. The footsteps grew louder, crossing from the carpeted stairs onto the hardwood floor of the corridor. It was not the light, hurried step of a night nurse. It was the heavy tread of one of the private security guards making an unscheduled patrol. 95%. The shadow of a man blocked the faint sliver of light beneath the office door. He had stopped right outside. I held my breath, my finger hovering over the eject button. The brass doorknob of the office slowly began to turn. I snatched the micro-memory card from the side port of the laptop and shoved it deep into the pocket of my pajama pants. I snapped the laptop shut instantly, plunging the room back into darkness, and dove behind the heavy velvet curtains, framing the bay window just as the heavy oak door swung open. A bright beam from a high-powered flashlight swept violently across the room. It was the head of the private estate security team. He paused in the center of the office, the beam resting directly on the mahogany desk I had just vacated. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold glass of the window pane. The silence was so profound I could hear my own heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. If he found me in here, Camilla would know I had accessed the servers. After what felt like an eternity, the guard grunted, pulled the door shut, and continued his scheduled patrol down the corridor. I did not wait a single second. I slipped out from behind the curtain and retraced my steps through the dark labyrinth of the second floor, pushing my fractured pelvis to the absolute physical limit. Pain blinded me with every single step, sending hot waves of agony up my spine, but pure adrenaline fueled my desperate descent. I reached my guest suite on the third floor, slid under the covers, and pulled the heavy duvet up to my chin. Less than 2 minutes later, the brass door handle clicked. The hallway light spilled into the room, framing Camilla's imposing silhouette. She stood there for a long time, watching my chest rise and fall in a feigned, steady rhythm of deep sleep. Satisfied that her prisoner was still utterly defeated and secured, she closed the door. I let out a long, shaky exhale, clutching the tiny piece of plastic in my pocket. I had the ultimate weapon. Now I just needed to deliver it to my only ally. The next afternoon, the estate was suffocatingly quiet. I sat in a high-backed chair by the window, staring blankly at the manicured lawns below, perfectly maintaining my facade of a broken, grieving woman whose spirit had been completely crushed. A sharp knock on the door broke the heavy silence. The private nurse opened it, stepping aside to let Trey enter. He carried a large, ostentatious bouquet of white lilies, looking every bit the concerned brother-in-law making a polite family visit. "I am so sorry to disturb you, Sloane," Trey said loudly, ensuring his voice carried clearly to the nurse stationed in the hallway. "Kelsey wanted me to drop these off and check on your recovery. She is terribly worried about you and hopes you are resting comfortably." I slowly turned my head, letting my eyes register his presence with a delayed, hollow gaze. "Thank you, Trey," I said, keeping my voice intentionally weak and raspy. "That is very kind of her to think of me." He walked over to the small antique table near my chair and set the heavy crystal vase down. As he turned back to face me, his eyes locked onto mine. There was no pity in his expression, only a sharp, calculating intensity that matched my own. The nurse remained standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching our interaction closely per Camilla's strict, paranoid orders. We had only seconds to execute the transfer. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the armrest, wincing as a genuine spike of sharp pain shot through my lower back. Trey stepped forward immediately to steady me, wrapping his strong arms around my shoulders in a supportive, familial embrace. It was the absolute perfect cover. I buried my face against the lapel of his tailored suit jacket. My hand slipped out of my pocket, palming the tiny memory card. With practiced precision, I slid my hand down his side and dropped the card straight into his exterior pocket. "Cayman Islands," I whispered, my lips barely moving against the expensive fabric of his suit. "Fraud. 48 million gone." She pushed me to stop the bank audit. I felt his entire body tense for a fraction of a second. He did not gasp. He did not pull away or look down. The elite corporate attorney inside him absorbed the massive legal implications instantly. When he finally stepped back to look at me, his eyes had narrowed with a lethal, predatory legal focus. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had the ammunition he needed to build a federal case that would tear this arrogant family to the ground. "You just focus on getting your strength back," Sloane, Trey said, his voice smooth and deeply reassuring for the benefit of the eavesdropping nurse. "Everything else will be handled. I promise you that." He turned and walked confidently out of the room, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the air conditioning. The crushing tension in my chest finally loosened slightly. The data was out of the house. The federal trap was officially set. But my relief was violently short-lived. Less than an hour later, heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my door. The door swung open without a single knock. Bennett marched into the room, his jaw set in a line of forced, unnatural determination. He was not alone. Behind him stood a stern woman in a stark gray business suit holding a thick leather portfolio. It was a licensed public notary. Bennett stepped right up to my chair and tossed a familiar stack of thick legal documents onto the table right beside the lilies. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." "I am done waiting," Sloane Bennett declared, his voice trembling slightly despite his aggressive posture. "My mother has been more than accommodating, keeping you here, paying for your expensive private medical care. But this ends today. I brought the notary. You are going to sign these divorce papers right now, and you are going to pack your bags. You are leaving this estate today, and you are leaving my family forever." I looked at the documents, then up at my cowardly husband. He thought he was throwing me out into the cold, penniless and defeated. He had absolutely no idea that I was about to gladly walk out the front door, leaving him trapped inside a burning building. I looked at the thick stack of legal documents resting next to the crystal vase of lilies, and then back up at my cowardly husband. He puffed out his chest, trying to project an air of authority that he simply did not possess. Camilla stepped into the room right behind him, crossing her arms and watching me with the sharp, predatory gaze of a hawk circling a wounded animal. "We are not completely heartless, Sloane," Camilla said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "Bennett has graciously agreed to provide you with a settlement of $100,000. It is more than enough for a woman of your modest background to find a small apartment and start over. But that is our final offer. If you fight us in court, my lawyers will drag this out for years until you are bankrupt and destroyed. I stared at the check resting on top of the petition. $100,000. It was an insultingly low number for a family supposedly sitting on a $50 million fortune. But to me, it was the ultimate confirmation of everything I had found on that laptop. They were liquidating whatever small cash reserves they had left just to make me go away quickly. They were terrified. Bennett tapped his expensive leather shoe against the hardwood floor, growing impatient. "Well," he snapped, "are you going to sign it, or are we going to do this the hard way?" I let my shoulders cave inward. I looked down at my hands, allowing them to tremble just enough to sell the performance. I did not argue. I did not demand half of his assets or threaten to expose their secrets. I simply reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen the notary had placed on the table. As I uncapped the pen, my mind was perfectly clear. By signing these documents, I was legally severing myself from Bennett. But more importantly, I was completely insulating myself from the massive federal fallout that was about to hit this family. When the authorities eventually came for Camilla, I would be entirely removed from the blast radius. I pressed the pen to the paper. I signed my name on the first page, then the second. I initialed the asset forfeiture clauses and the non-disclosure agreements they had hastily thrown together. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a heavy chain snapping. I was not signing away my life. I was signing their death warrant. When I finished the final page, the notary stepped forward, stamped the documents, and quietly packed her briefcase. Bennett let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, as if he had just survived a grueling battle. Camilla smiled. It was a cold, victorious smirk that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You have 10 minutes to pack your things," Camilla ordered. "The security guards will escort you to the front gates. Do not try to take anything that belongs to this house." I did not say a word. I stood up slowly, favoring my healing pelvis, and walked over to the small closet. I pulled out a single canvas duffel bag and packed the few items of clothing I had arrived with. I left the expensive jewelry Bennett had bought me over the years resting on the dresser. I did not want a single piece of their tainted money. When I walked out of the guest suite, 2 burly security guards were waiting for me in the hallway. They flanked me as I made my slow, agonizing descent down the grand, sweeping staircase. The house staff stood in the corners watching silently as the former lady of the house was marched out like a criminal. Bennett and Camilla stood on the second-floor landing looking down at me with absolute triumph. I reached the massive front doors. A guard pulled them open and the cold Connecticut air hit my face. I stepped out onto the gravel driveway, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind me with a resounding final thud. I walked the quarter-mile down the long, winding driveway toward the imposing iron security gates. The guards in the gatehouse pressed a button, and the massive iron bars slowly swung open, groaning in the quiet afternoon air. I stepped through onto the public road, and the gates immediately locked shut behind me. I stood alone on the edge of the road holding my single duffel bag. A black luxury SUV was idling on the shoulder just a few yards away. The tinted passenger window rolled down, revealing Trey sitting in the driver's seat. He reached over and pushed the passenger door open for me. I climbed into the plush leather seat and pulled the heavy door shut. The moment the latch clicked, my performance ended entirely. The trembling stopped. The defeated slump of my shoulders vanished. I sat up perfectly straight, a genuine freezing cold smile spreading across my face. Trey put the car in drive and pulled away from the estate, leaving the iron gates fading into the distance. "Did you sign them?" he asked, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "I signed everything," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. "I am officially disconnected from the estate. Now we just wait for the engagement party. Let them spend the money they do not have." The next 6 months were a grueling masterclass in patience and endurance. While Bennett and Camilla celebrated my departure and reveled in their false sense of security, my entire world shrank to the size of a plastic incubator in the neonatal intensive care unit. Every single morning, I walked through the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the hospital long before the sun came up. I sat beside the humming machinery that was keeping my son alive. He was so tiny when he was first born, his skin practically translucent, a fragile testament to the violence his grandmother had inflicted upon us. I named him Leo because he was fighting with the heart of a lion. For the first 2 months, it was touch and go. The alarms on his monitors would blare unexpectedly, sending nurses rushing into the room, while I stood frozen in the corner praying for a miracle. I could not hold him. I could only slip my sterilized hand through the circular ports of the incubator and let his tiny fingers curl around my index finger. My own body was slowly healing from the fractured pelvis, a constant dull ache that served as a daily reminder of the betrayal. But during those terrifying quiet hours, my anger was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. I channeled every ounce of my fear into raw, focused productivity. While Leo slept, I worked. I turned my small rented apartment into a secure war room. Trey visited twice a week under the cover of darkness, bringing encrypted laptops and massive stacks of legal briefs. He was carefully balancing his marriage to Kelsey with our secret operation driven by his deep disgust for Camilla's relentless arrogance. Together, we took the massive data dump I had smuggled out of the estate on that micro memory card and meticulously built a bulletproof dossier for the Securities and Exchange Commission. We did not just highlight the missing $48 million. We mapped out the entire anatomy of Camilla's fraud. As a forensic auditor, I knew that federal prosecutors loved a clean, easy-to-read narrative. I traced every single wire transfer from the grandfather trust to the phantom limited liability companies in the Cayman Islands. Trey used his elite corporate legal expertise to subpoena public records that linked those shell companies directly to Camilla's offshore gambling debts in Macau and Monaco. We built a paper trail so solid and undeniable that not even the most expensive defense attorneys in Manhattan would be able to punch a hole in it. By the 5th month, the tides began to turn in our favor. Leo finally started breathing completely on his own. He gained weight, his cheeks filling out his bright eyes opening to follow my voice when I read to him. The doctors were astounded by his incredible resilience. They eventually moved him out of the intensive care unit and into a standard crib. He was healthy. He was perfect. And most importantly, his existence was still a complete secret from the people who had tried to erase him. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon during the 6th month, Trey walked into my apartment. He did not bother knocking. He tossed a glossy, thick envelope onto my kitchen counter. His face was set in a hard, uncompromising line. "It is happening," Trey said, loosening his silk tie. "Camilla just sent out the formal invitations. She rented out the main ballroom at the Pierre Hotel for this weekend. It is supposed to be a massive exclusive gala for the New York elite." I picked up the heavy gold embossed invitation. I did not need to ask what the occasion was. "Bennett is getting married again," I said, reading the elegant cursive script on the card. Trey let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Not just married. He is officially engaged to Paige Kensington. She is the sole heiress to a massive global shipping conglomerate. Her family is worth billions. Camilla has been aggressively orchestrating this match behind the scenes ever since you signed the divorce papers." The puzzle pieces snapped together perfectly in my mind. Camilla was not just trying to secure a prestigious daughter-in-law. She was hunting for a bailout. With the trust fund nearly completely drained and the threat of a federal bank audit looming the moment Bennett produced an heir, Camilla needed an immediate injection of capital. She was planning to use Paige's massive dowry and family assets to quietly patch the $48 million hole in the trust before anyone noticed the money was missing. She was literally selling her son to cover her federal crimes. "It is a brilliant, desperate move," I murmured, tossing the invitation back onto the granite counter. "But she is completely out of time. Are the federal filings ready to go?" Trey nodded, a predatory gleam in his dark eyes. "The dossier is finalized. I have my direct contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI on standby. The moment you give the signal, they will execute the freeze orders on every single account attached to that family." I walked over to the bassinet resting in the center of my living room. I reached down and picked up Leo. He cooed softly, resting his warm, heavy head against my shoulder. He was safe. The fear that had gripped my chest for the last half-year finally evaporated, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated resolve. I looked at Trey, holding my perfectly healthy baby boy tight against my chest. It is time to collect their debts. The weekend arrived with a bitter chill in the Manhattan air, but inside the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and dripping with unearned opulence. The space was transformed into a gilded wonderland. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the crystal chandeliers overhead. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos glided across the polished marble floor, carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and beluga caviar. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the absolute highest tier of New York society. There were Wall Street executives, real estate tycoons, and a carefully curated selection of journalists from elite society magazines. Camilla had spared absolutely no expense for this engagement gala. Of course, she was paying for all of it with lines of credit she intended to erase using her future daughter-in-law's money. I stood in the opulent hallway just outside the main ballroom, hidden in the shadows, behind a massive marble pillar. Trey was inside feeding me updates through a discreet wireless earpiece. The plan was in motion. Through the crack in the heavy mahogany doors, I could see Bennett holding court near the center of the room. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket, looking incredibly smug and perfectly at ease. Paige stood next to him, her arm looped through his, wearing a diamond engagement ring, so large it caught the light from across the room. Bennett smiled and laughed, charming the circle of wealthy investors surrounding them. Looking at him, an outside observer would never guess that just 6 months ago, he was married to a woman he allowed his mother to push off a balcony. He had not spent a single second mourning me or the child he thought we lost. To Bennett, women were never partners. We were stepping stones. I was supposed to be the key to his trust fund. When I became a liability, he discarded me without a second thought. Now Paige was his shiny new life raft, a billionaire heiress whose fortune would prop up his fragile ego and his mother's crumbling empire. A sharp tapping sound echoed through the ballroom. Camilla stood on the elevated stage at the front of the room, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The low murmur of the elite crowd gradually faded into a respectful silence. The string quartet in the corner transitioned into a soft, elegant melody. Camilla stepped up to the microphone. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, looking every inch the triumphant matriarch. "Thank you all for joining us on this magnificent evening," she began, her voice projecting a smooth, practiced warmth. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating a union of two wonderful people. We are celebrating the joining of two great American legacies." She gestured gracefully toward Bennett and Paige. The crowd offered a polite murmur of applause. Bennett puffed out his chest, completely soaking in the unearned admiration. "When my husband passed away, he entrusted me with the future of this family." Camilla continued, placing a dramatic hand over her heart. "It has always been my greatest duty to ensure our financial and cultural legacy remains secure for generations to come." Finding the right partner for Bennett was paramount. We needed someone who understood the weight of our history and the magnitude of our future. "Paige, my dear, your family has built an incredible global shipping empire. By bringing our families together, we are securing a foundation that will stand the test of time. We are building a fortress of prosperity." I listened to her speech from the hallway, feeling a cold, hard knot of disgust tighten in my stomach. She was standing in front of the most powerful people in the city, boldly lying to their faces. She was talking about financial legacy while sitting on a $48 million crater of gambling debts and offshore fraud. She was using Paige's dowry to plug the holes in her sinking ship, and she was doing it with a smile. In my earpiece, Trey's voice crackled to life. He kept his tone low and even. "The federal agents are in position at the service elevators. The freeze orders on the Cayman accounts were executed 2 minutes ago. Her credit cards are already declining at the hotel bar. You are clear to go." I reached down and smoothed the fabric of my tailored crimson power suit. I did not wear black to mourn them. I wore red for the blood they tried to spill and for the absolute financial massacre I was about to unleash. I took a deep breath, letting the final traces of the woman they thought they broke slip away completely. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar and walked directly toward the entrance. I placed both hands on the ornate brass handles of the massive double doors and pushed with all my strength. The heavy doors swung open with a loud, resounding crash that echoed over the microphone. The string quartet screeched to a sudden, jarring halt. Every single head in the packed ballroom turned toward the entrance at the exact same time. I stepped over the threshold, the click of my stiletto heels cutting through the sudden, deafening silence. I was not the broken, weeping woman they had last seen shuffling out of their estate in sweatpants with a single canvas duffel bag. I wore a tailored, razor-sharp crimson power suit. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style, and my expression was completely void of the nervous deference I used to show this family. I looked exactly like what I was. A federal predator stepping into a room full of prey. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of socialites. Whispers erupted instantly, spreading like wildfire from the back of the room to the front. People who had attended my wedding to Bennett, people who had been told I was safely locked away in a psychiatric facility or living in squalor, stared at me in absolute shock. Camilla gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard her knuckles turned completely white. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and suddenly very old beneath the heavy crystal chandeliers. The triumphant, arrogant smile she had worn just seconds ago vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Bennett took a physical step backward, dropping Paige's arm as if she had suddenly caught fire. He looked like he had just seen a ghost, and in a way he had. Security. Camilla shrieked into the microphone, her polished society voice cracking into a desperate shrill command. Guards, get her out of here immediately. She is trespassing. She is unstable. Remove her. 4 massive men in dark suits stepped out from the perimeter of the ballroom, moving swiftly to intercept me. They formed a physical wall between me and the elevated stage, their hands reaching out to grab my arms. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I reached into the breast pocket of my crimson blazer and pulled out a leather case. I flipped it open, revealing a gold federal badge and my newly printed identification card. During the 6 months I had spent building the case with Trey, my superiors at the agency had reviewed my meticulous work and granted me a full promotion to senior special investigator. I was no longer just an auditor. I carried the full weight of the federal government. "Back off!" I said, my voice cold and loud enough to carry to the front of the room. "Unless you want an obstruction of justice charge added to the federal indictment that is about to drop on this family." The security guards froze. They were expensive private muscle hired to handle drunken socialites and paparazzi, not federal agents. They looked at the badge, then looked nervously up at Camilla on the stage, clearly unwilling to risk their own freedom for a paycheck. Slowly they stepped aside, clearing a path directly to the center of the room. The whispers in the crowd reached a fever pitch. Federal indictment. The words hung in the air, instantly poisoning the opulent atmosphere of the gala. The wealthy investors who had just been laughing with Bennett suddenly looked incredibly uncomfortable, subtly shifting their weight and taking small steps away from him. In their world, proximity to a federal investigation was a highly contagious disease. I walked straight down the center aisle, my eyes locked directly on the stage. Camilla was breathing heavily, her chest heaving under her emerald gown. She looked frantically toward the side exit, but I knew federal agents were already blocking every single door in the hotel. There was absolutely no way out. I did not stop at the podium. I ignored Camilla entirely. I walked past my trembling, cowardly ex-husband and stopped directly in front of Paige. She was young, beautiful, and completely bewildered. She looked at my crimson suit, then at the federal badge still in my hand, and finally up at my face. She did not look arrogant. She looked like a woman who suddenly realized she was standing in the middle of a burning building without a fire exit. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. It contained the distilled, undeniable truth of the family she was about to marry into. The offshore ledgers, the forged tax returns, the massive gambling debts, and the precise, horrifying sum of the $48 million Camilla had stolen. I held the folder out to her. The entire ballroom held its breath. "You might want to take a look at this before you sign a marriage license," I said quietly, ensuring only she and Bennett could hear me. Paige hesitated for a fraction of a second. She looked at Bennett, whose face had turned the color of wet ash. He reached out a trembling hand, trying to position himself between his new fiancée and the damning evidence I held. "Paige, do not take that from her." Bennett stammered, his voice completely lacking any real authority. "She is just trying to cause a scene. She is unwell." Paige pulled her arm away from his grasp. She was the sole heiress to a massive global shipping conglomerate. She had been raised in boardrooms, trained since childhood to identify bad investments and corporate liabilities. She did not look at Bennett with love. She looked at him with sudden, sharp suspicion. She reached out and took the black leather folder from my hands. She opened the heavy cover. The first page was the stark, undeniable summary of the federal forensic audit. I watched her eyes dart across the page, taking in the official government seals, the highlighted offshore routing numbers, and the final glaring negative balance. She flipped to the second page, which detailed the millions of dollars wired directly from the family trust to high-stakes casinos in Macau and Monaco. "Before you marry him, you might want to look at his actual net worth," I said, my voice cutting through the tense, suffocating silence of the ballroom. I kept my tone perfectly level, letting the devastating facts do all the heavy lifting. "He is not bringing $50 million to your marriage, Paige. He is bringing a federal indictment. Your family wealth was never going to fund your future together. It was going to pay off his mother's illegal offshore gambling debts." Paige gasped softly. The folder trembled in her hands. She looked up from the spreadsheets, her eyes wide with horrified realization, and stared directly at Bennett. "Is this true?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Did your mother drain the trust fund?" From her elevated position on the stage, Camilla saw the black folder open in Paige's hands. Even from 20 feet away, she recognized the watermarked bank logos on the printed ledgers. The polished, elegant society matriarch mask completely shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered criminal underneath. She let out a guttural, furious scream that echoed terribly over the microphone. "Bennett, grab that folder right now. Do not let her read those lies." Camilla shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at us. Bennett lunged forward clumsily, desperate to obey his mother's command. But Paige was faster. She took a swift step backward, holding the documents tight against her chest, safely out of his reach. I stepped smoothly between them, forcing Bennett to halt his advance. I stared directly into his panicked, cowardly eyes. "Do not even think about touching her, Bennett," I warned him. "You are already an accomplice to wire fraud. Do not add assault to your charges today." Camilla scrambled down the stairs of the stage, her expensive emerald gown catching on the wooden steps. She ripped the fabric free and pushed her way fiercely through the whispering crowd of elite guests. "Security," she yelled, her face flushed dark red with rage. "I gave you a direct order to remove this woman." The 4 massive private security guards remained firmly rooted to their spots near the walls. They looked at the floor, actively avoiding her gaze. They had seen my federal badge. They knew that laying a hand on a federal agent conducting an active investigation was a guaranteed one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. They were not going to ruin their lives to protect a woman whose checks were about to bounce. Camilla sneered at them in absolute disgust. "Fine. If the hired help will not do their jobs, I will call someone who will." She pulled a sleek gold smartphone from her evening clutch. Her hands were shaking violently with adrenaline, but she managed to dial a number from her favorites list. She pressed the speaker icon and held the phone up high, making sure the entire front row of the crowd could hear her flex her ultimate local power. She was calling the local chief of police. He was a corrupt family friend who had been on Camilla's secret payroll for over a decade, funded by the very same trust she had drained. Chief Camilla barked the moment the line connected. "This is Camilla. I am at the Pierre Hotel. My former daughter-in-law has crashed my private event. She is harassing my guests, trespassing, and attempting to extort my family with forged financial documents. I want her arrested and dragged out of here immediately." The gruff voice of the police chief echoed from the small speaker. "I have patrol cars 2 blocks away, Camilla. Keep her there. I will be in the lobby in 5 minutes to personally slap the cuffs on her." Camilla ended the call and shoved the phone back into her clutch. She turned to me, a triumphant, malicious grin spreading across her face. She thought she had just played her trump card. She thought she had won. She had absolutely no idea that calling local law enforcement to a federal crime scene was exactly what I wanted her to do. The 5 minutes of waiting felt like an agonizing lifetime for everyone in that opulent ballroom except for me. For me, it was a perfectly orchestrated countdown. I stood completely still in the center of the marble floor. I did not attempt to run, and I did not break eye contact with my ex-husband. Around us, the whispers of the New York elite grew into a loud, frantic buzz. Wealthy investors were already pulling out their phones, frantically texting their wealth managers to pull out of any deals associated with Bennett's family. They smelled the blood in the water. Paige was still reading. She had reached the section detailing the forged quarterly earnings reports. Her hands were shaking violently now. The massive diamond engagement ring on her finger caught the light, but it no longer looked like a symbol of love. It looked like a very expensive shackle. Bennett tried to step toward her again, reaching out to take the folder, but she held up a hand, completely shutting him down without even looking at him. She was realizing that the man she was supposed to marry was nothing more than a hollow shell wrapped in an expensive tuxedo. Then the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom burst open for the second time that night. The chief of police marched in accompanied by 2 large patrol officers. He was a broad, imposing man who carried himself not like a public servant, but like a mob enforcer. His uniform was crisp, but his morals had been bought and paid for over a decade ago. He had been on Camilla's secret payroll for years, receiving massive cash injections from the trust fund to make her various legal problems disappear. He was her ultimate attack dog. "There she is!" Camilla shrieked from the stage, pointing a manicured finger directly at me. Her voice was completely stripped of its usual refined elegance. "Arrest her right now. She is a danger to my family." The chief did not hesitate. He completely ignored standard police protocol. He did not ask for my statement. He did not ask to see my identification. He did not even acknowledge the federal badge that was still clearly visible in my hand. He marched straight up to me, his face twisted in an ugly, arrogant sneer that mirrored Camilla's perfectly. "Put your hands behind your back," he barked. He grabbed my shoulder with unnecessary bruising force, spinning me around to face the crowd. "You are under arrest for trespassing, harassment, and attempted extortion." I did not resist. I let him pull my arms behind my back. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around my wrists. He tightened them aggressively, the steel biting painfully into my skin. He wanted to humiliate me in front of the city's most powerful people. He wanted to break me down and show Camilla that he was worth every single penny she paid him. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as the cuffs clicked securely into place. The socialites watched in stunned silence as a woman in a tailored crimson power suit was restrained like a violent criminal right in the middle of a luxury engagement gala. The string quartet remained completely frozen. Seeing me in handcuffs suddenly restored Bennett's cowardly bravado. The paralyzing fear that had gripped him just moments ago vanished entirely. He stepped forward, adjusting the lapels of his velvet dinner jacket, a smug, sickening grin spreading across his face. "You always were crazy, Sloane." Bennett laughed loudly, ensuring the crowd could hear him. He shook his head with mock pity. "You actually thought you could walk in here and ruin my life with a fake federal badge and a folder full of lies? You brought this entirely on yourself. Enjoy your night in a holding cell. I will make sure the judge throws the book at you tomorrow morning." Camilla walked down the steps of the stage, her confidence returning in full force now that her hired gun had arrived. She stopped a few feet away from me, crossing her arms triumphantly. "Take her out the back exit, Chief," she ordered coldly. "I do not want the press in the lobby taking photos of this lunatic ruining my beautiful event." The chief nodded deferentially to Camilla. "Let's go," he growled, shoving me forward by the shoulder. I stumbled slightly but quickly regained my footing. I did not yell. I did not struggle against the tight metal cuffs biting into my wrists. I stood up straight, turning my head to look directly into the eyes of the corrupt police chief. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "I have just one question before we go," I said quietly, my voice laced with absolute venom. "Did you use your personal bank account to accept Camilla's bribes, or did you set up a shell company? Because the feds really prefer when it is personal. It makes the wire fraud charges so much easier to prove. The chief froze. The arrogant sneer wiped completely off his face in a fraction of a second. His hand, which was gripping my shoulder, suddenly went slack. He looked at me, his eyes widening with a sudden dawning horror as the weight of my words registered in his mind. The chief stood completely paralyzed. The heavy steel handcuffs binding my wrists clinked softly in the silent ballroom, but his grip on my shoulder had vanished entirely. He looked at me, not as a helpless woman he could bully, but as a live grenade that had just been dropped into his lap. He knew instantly that I was not bluffing. The specific mention of a shell company meant I had seen the hidden ledgers. Camilla, however, was completely oblivious to the sudden shift in power. Standing on the marble floor a few feet away, she stamped her designer heel in frustration. "What are you waiting for?" Camilla barked, her face flushed with indignant rage. "Stop staring at her and get her out of my sight. Drag her out the back service elevator if you have to." The chief swallowed hard. Pure survival instinct kicked in. He figured his only chance was to get me out of that room before I could say anything else in front of the press and the city elite. He grabbed my arm again, rougher this time to mask his trembling fingers, and shoved me toward the main double doors. "Move," he growled under his breath. We took exactly 3 steps before our path was completely cut off. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped directly into the center of the double doors, physically blocking the only exit from the ballroom. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase. It was Trey. The crowd murmured again. To the socialites in the room, Trey was just the quiet, diverse son-in-law Camilla liked to parade around at charity events to prove her open-mindedness. To Camilla, he was a subordinate who was supposed to stand in the background and look grateful for his inclusion in their wealthy family. "Trey, what on earth are you doing?" Camilla shrieked, marching forward. Her voice was dripping with absolute venom. "Get out of the way right now. You are embarrassing Kelsey in front of all these people. Go stand with your wife." I glanced over at Kelsey, who was standing near the edge of the crowd. She looked completely bewildered, her hands covering her mouth in shock as she watched her husband actively defy her mother for the very first time. Trey did not even look at his wife. He kept his dark, intense eyes locked entirely on Camilla. He reached up and slowly, deliberately straightened his silk tie. His posture was impeccable, projecting the absolute authority of a man who had just trapped his prey. "I am not here as your son-in-law," Camilla Trey said. His voice was smooth, commanding, and echoed clearly across the silent ballroom. "I am here as Sloane's retained corporate attorney, and you are currently attempting to illegally detain my client." A wave of frantic whispering swept through the elite crowd. Camilla stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process the rebellion happening right in front of her face. Bennett let out a pathetic, confused noise from the stage, entirely incapable of handling the escalating situation. Trey turned his attention to the corrupt police chief, who was still awkwardly holding my arm. The chief tried to puff out his chest to maintain authority, but he was visibly sweating under the bright crystal chandeliers. "Counselor," the chief said, attempting to sound tough, "your client is under arrest for trespassing and extortion. Step aside and let my officers do their job, or I will arrest you for obstructing an officer of the law." Trey did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply popped the brass latches of his leather briefcase and reached inside. "Oh, I strongly advise against that," Chief Trey said smoothly. "Because you no longer have any jurisdiction in this building. Or in this city, for that matter." Trey pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, topped with a bright blue cover sheet, bearing the official seal of the United States Federal Court. He stepped forward and slapped the documents directly against the police chief's chest, forcing the man to let go of me to catch the heavy paperwork. "That is an emergency federal injunction," Trey announced, his voice ringing with absolute legal finality. "It was signed 20 minutes ago by a federal judge. It immediately strips you and the local police department of all jurisdiction over Sloane. Furthermore, it designates this entire hotel ballroom as an active federal crime scene under the authority of the Securities and Exchange Commission." The chief stared down at the federal seal on the document. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. The 2 patrol officers standing behind him immediately took a large step back, instinctively distancing themselves from their compromised boss. If you do not remove those handcuffs from my client in the next 3 seconds, Trey continued, stepping so close to the chief that they were practically chest to chest. I will personally add federal kidnapping and civil rights violations to the massive wire fraud indictment that is about to end your miserable career. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. The chief looked at Camilla, who was staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes, completely powerless to save him. Then, with shaking hands, the chief reached into his belt, pulled out his keys, and unlocked the heavy steel cuffs around my wrists. The heavy steel cuffs dropped to the polished marble floor with a sharp clatter. I rubbed my raw wrists, feeling the blood rush back into my hands. The police chief took a massive step away from me, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on an active landmine. He had completely surrendered his authority the second Trey produced that federal document. The ballroom was descending into absolute pandemonium. Wealthy guests were shoving past each other to reach the main exits, desperate to distance themselves from a highly publicized federal crime scene. The hotel manager, a short man whose tuxedo was now soaked with nervous perspiration, rushed over to us. He practically begged Camilla and Trey to move this confrontation out of the public eye before the press caught wind of the scandal. Trey agreed, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors of the hotel's private executive office, located just off the main lobby. We filed into the opulent room one by one. Me, Trey, Camilla, Bennett Page, and the severely compromised police chief. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, sealing us off from the frantic paparazzi and the fleeing socialites, the chaotic standoff truly began. Camilla immediately began pacing the length of the oriental rug like a caged animal. She was furiously whispering to the police chief, demanding he call in favors, completely ignoring the fact that his career was already over. Paige stood rigidly in the furthest corner of the room, her back pressed against the mahogany bookshelf. She was still clutching the black folder of financial evidence I had given her, staring at Bennett with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Seeing Paige pull away from him completely broke the remaining shreds of Bennett's arrogant facade. The false bravado he had paraded around the ballroom evaporated entirely. He looked at his mother, who was uselessly arguing with the defeated cop. He looked at Paige, who refused to even meet his eyes. Then he looked at me. Bennett rushed across the room and grabbed my arm, attempting to pull me into the far corner near the heavy velvet drapes. He wanted privacy, completely unaware that privacy no longer existed for him. "Sloane, please," Bennett begged. His voice was a pathetic, trembling whisper that made my stomach turn. "You have made your point. You terrified us. You ruined the gala. But you have to call this off. Call off the federal agents right now." I stared at him, my face completely expressionless. "I cannot call off a federal indictment, Bennett. The wheels are already turning." He tightened his grip on my sleeve, his eyes wide with desperate, animalistic panic. "Yes, you can. You are the lead investigator now. You can bury the file. You can tell your superiors the numbers were a mistake or a computer glitch. Look, I will pay you. I will give you $5 million cash right now. Just take the money and disappear." "Where exactly are you going to get $5 million? I asked coldly. "The trust is completely empty." From Paige, he blurted out, his voice cracking with desperation. He did not even care that his wealthy fiancée was standing on the other side of the room. "Her family is transferring $10 million to my accounts tomorrow morning as a wedding gift. I will wire half of it directly to you. Please, Sloane, do not do this to me." I did not pull away. I wanted him to keep talking. I wanted him to dig his grave so deep he could never climb out. "You knew," I stated flatly, keeping my eyes locked on his. "You knew she was stealing the money this entire time." Bennett let out a pathetic, suffocating sob. "Of course I knew. I have known for 5 years. But what was I supposed to do? She is my mother. She said she would fix it. She said she just needed time to win it back at the tables. If I exposed her, I would lose the cars, the estate, the lifestyle. I had to protect my future." "And what about me?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "What about my future? What about the baby?" "You were going to trigger the bank audit?" Bennett pleaded, tears actually streaming down his face now. He was completely pathetic, a grown man crying over the loss of his unearned wealth. "When you got pregnant, the bank sent a notice. They were going to audit the trust the day the baby was born. We had no choice, Sloane. If she went to prison, I would be left with nothing. I had to let her get rid of you. I had to sign those divorce papers so you could not claim any of the remaining assets. I knew she pushed you, but I had to protect the family. The truth hung in the air, toxic and heavy. For years, I had convinced myself that Bennett was just weak. I thought he was a victim of his mother's relentless manipulation, a man too afraid to stand up for his wife. But his confession laid his true nature completely bare. He was not a victim. He was an active, willing accomplice. He knew his mother shoved me off that terrace to stop a bank audit, and he helped her cover it up to protect his allowance. He sold my life and the life of his unborn child to maintain his country club membership. I looked at the tears streaming down his face and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the cold, clinical satisfaction of a forensic auditor closing a perfectly documented case. I reached into the pocket of my crimson blazer and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was brightly lit, displaying an active audio call. The call duration was currently at 45 minutes. I had dialed Trey the moment I stepped out of my car at the hotel. I pressed the speaker button on the screen. The audio shifted instantly. "Did you get all of that, Trey?" I asked, my voice ringing clearly through the small speaker amplified by the absolute silence of the executive office. Loud and clear, Trey replied from across the room. He was holding his own phone up the screen, mirroring my active call. The entire room had heard every single word of his confession. Camilla stood frozen for a fraction of a second as the reality of the broadcast sank in. The elegant matriarch, who had manipulated high society for decades, was suddenly reduced to a cornered, desperate animal. The facade of aristocratic grace shattered completely. She let out a guttural shriek of pure, unfiltered rage. She lunged across the expensive oriental rug, her manicured hands extended like claws, aiming directly for the smartphone in my hand. She wanted to smash the device foolishly, believing that destroying the phone would somehow erase the damning audio file stored securely on federal servers. "Give me that phone," she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity. "I will kill you." She never even made it past the center of the room. Trey stepped forward with the effortless grace of a man who was always 2 steps ahead of his opponents. He intercepted her path, catching her wrists mid-air. He did not hurt her, but his grip was absolute and unyielding. He held her back effortlessly as she thrashed and kicked the hem of her custom emerald gown, tearing loudly as she struggled against him. "Calm down," Camilla, Trey commanded. His voice echoed through the private office with absolute legal authority. "Assaulting a federal investigator is a mandatory prison sentence. You have already done enough damage to yourself today. Stop fighting before I press additional charges on behalf of my client." "Let me go," she hissed, her face contorted with an ugly, toxic hatred. "You ungrateful parasite. I brought you into this family. I gave you a seat at my table. I gave you everything. You gave me nothing but headaches and bigotry," Trey replied coldly. He released her wrists and gently shoved her backward. She stumbled, her expensive heels catching on the rug, and barely caught her balance against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. Before Camilla could regain her footing and launch another hysterical attack, the sharp professional ring of Trey's smartphone cut through the heavy tension in the office. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his device. He looked at the caller identification, a sharp, victorious smile touching the corners of his mouth. He pressed the accept button and immediately tapped the speaker icon, holding the phone up high for the entire room to hear. "Counselor," a deep, authoritative voice boomed from the small speaker. It was Director Mitchell from the Securities and Exchange Commission. "I am here," Director Trey answered, keeping his dark eyes locked firmly on Camilla. "We have confirmation from the field agents," the director announced clearly. "The federal warrants have been fully executed as of 2 minutes ago. All domestic accounts tied to the Grandfather Trust have been officially seized. Furthermore, our international liaisons have successfully frozen the offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Every single cent is locked down pending the criminal investigation." "Thank you," Director Trey said smoothly. "We have the suspects contained in the hotel management office. The corrupt local authorities have been relieved of their jurisdiction. We are currently waiting for your federal transport teams to arrive." "Excellent work, Counselor. My agents are pulling into the loading dock now. They will be up in 2 minutes." Trey ended the call. The silence that followed was suffocating and absolute. The words hung in the air heavy and completely devastating, frozen, seized, locked down. Camilla stared at the phone in Trey's hand, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly hollow and suddenly very old. She slowly raised her trembling hands, looking down at her massive diamond rings, her diamond tennis bracelet, and the custom designer gown she was wearing. None of it belonged to her anymore. It was all evidence of a massive federal wire fraud operation. "You cannot do this," Camilla whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic rasp. "My lawyers will destroy you. I will hire the best defense team in the country. I will tie this up in litigation for decades. You will never see the inside of a courtroom." "With what money, Camilla?" I asked, stepping out from behind Trey. She snapped her head toward me, her eyes wide and frantic. "What?" I took a slow, deliberate step forward, savoring the complete role reversal. I was no longer the frightened daughter-in-law she could bully and discard. I was the architect of her destruction. "Federal freeze orders do not leave you an allowance," I explained, keeping my voice completely devoid of pity. "They strip everything. The bank accounts, the credit cards, the secret emergency funds, the lines of credit you used to pay for this absurd gala. Even the cash in your designer wallet is currently considered evidence of a federal crime. You cannot hire a high-priced defense team because you cannot even afford to pay a retainer fee." Bennett let out a low, pathetic whimper from the corner of the room. He sank down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest and burying his face in his hands. "You are completely broke," I continued, my words landing like heavy blows. "You do not have a single cent to your name. When you walk out of this hotel in handcuffs tonight, you will not be returning to your mansion in Connecticut. The government owns it now. You cannot even pay for a taxi ride home." The reality of her situation finally breached the towering fortress of her arrogance. Her knees buckled beneath her. She did not stumble or trip. She simply collapsed under the crushing weight of her absolute ruin. Camilla dropped to her knees on the oriental rug, her emerald gown pooling messily around her. She stared blankly at the floor, her chest heaving violently as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. She had spent her entire life worshipping wealth, sacrificing her own family to maintain the illusion of absolute power. Now the illusion was gone, leaving her with nothing but the cold reality of a prison cell. I did not step back or offer her a hand. I wanted her to feel the exact same crushing helplessness I felt when she shoved me off that terrace and left me bleeding on the marble patio. I stood over her, looking down at the ruined emerald fabric of her gown pooling on the oriental rug. "You thought you covered your tracks perfectly," I said, my voice cold and precise, cutting right through her pathetic gasping. "You thought routing the trust fund through those Cayman Island shell companies made the money completely invisible to the federal government. But you forgot exactly who you brought into your family. You invited a forensic auditor into your home." Camilla slowly looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. "I did not just find the missing $48 million. I continued, pacing slowly in front of her. "I mapped the entire anatomy of your fraud. I know you bypassed the bank security protocols by structuring the wire transfers in increments just under the federal reporting threshold. It is a classic amateur move called smurfing. You used phantom limited liability companies to funnel millions to high-stakes casinos in Macau and Monaco, but your gambling debts were only half of the story." I stopped pacing and shifted my gaze across the room. I locked eyes with the corrupt police chief who was standing nervously near the heavy mahogany door. "Losing that much money at the baccarat tables takes a lot of effort," I said, raising my voice so it echoed clearly in the private office. "But keeping the local authorities looking the other way while you steal from your own family trust requires a completely different type of investment. Does it not, Chief?" The chief stiffened instantly. His hand instinctively dropped to rest heavily on his duty belt. "What the hell are you talking about?" he growled, though his voice lacked any real conviction. Paige, who was still standing quietly in the corner, flipped to the third page of the black leather folder in her hands. She ran her manicured finger down a column of highlighted numbers. "There are recurring monthly payments here," Paige read aloud, her voice steady and clear. They are categorized as private security consulting fees paid out to a firm called Apex Solutions. I nodded toward Paige, acknowledging her sharp business acumen. Exactly. And if you run a basic corporate registry search on Apex Solutions, you will find it is registered to a post office box 2 towns over under the maiden name of the police chief's wife. The blood drained completely from the chief's face. The arrogant, bullying demeanor he had weaponized in the ballroom vanished in a fraction of a second. You did not just take cash bribes in brown paper bags, I explained, stepping toward him. You allowed Camilla to route hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen trust funds directly into your personal political action committees and fake consulting firms. You helped her cover up the hospital reports when she pushed me. You provided police escorts for her illegal gambling associates. You funded your entire career on the back of federal wire fraud. That is an absolute lie, the chief stammered, sweat beading rapidly on his forehead. You cannot prove any of that. Trey stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. We already proved it, Chief Trey stated, with absolute legal finality. The Securities and Exchange Commission has the routing numbers. The FBI has the bank statements. That is not just local municipal corruption. That is federal money laundering and conspiracy to defraud a financial institution. You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The chief realized in that exact moment that he was entirely trapped. He stopped puffing out his chest. He looked down at Camilla, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, completely useless to him now. His survival instinct overriding his badge, he slowly took a step backward, reaching blindly behind him for the brass handle of the office door. He thought if he could just slip out into the busy lobby, he could disappear into the chaotic crowd of fleeing socialites, call his underground contacts, and make a run for the border before the federal agents found him. He turned the handle quietly and pulled the heavy door open, slipping through the narrow crack without saying a single word to anyone in the room. But the hallway outside the executive office was no longer empty. Standing directly outside the door, completely blocking the only path to the lobby and freedom, were 2 massive men wearing dark suits and navy blue windbreakers with bright yellow FBI lettering printed across their chests. Special agents. The chief barely had time to register their presence or raise his hands. One of the agents grabbed him aggressively by the collar of his crisp uniform, spun him around with brutal efficiency, and slammed him hard against the floral wallpaper of the hotel corridor. The sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed loudly into the office, sealing his fate forever. The 2 federal agents pushed the neutralized police chief out into the corridor and handed him off to the local state troopers who had just arrived to assist. Then the lead special agent stepped fully into the executive office. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and eyes that scanned the room with cold, calculating precision. Camilla saw the bold yellow letters on his windbreaker and immediately tried to pivot. The sobbing, broken woman on the floor vanished, replaced by a desperate, frantic actress trying to salvage the final shreds of her life. She forced herself up from the oriental rug, smoothing down the ruined fabric of her emerald gown. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "Officers, thank God you are here!" Camilla cried out, her voice pitching up into a hysterical, practiced whine. "You have to arrest her. This woman is completely out of control. She is a disgruntled ex-wife who has been stalking my family. She is mentally unstable and she is trying to extort us with forged documents. She hijacked my son's engagement party and held us hostage in this room. Please, you have to get her away from us right now." The lead special agent did not even blink. He looked at Camilla, then looked over at me and gave a brief professional nod. He knew exactly who I was. He had read my file and coordinated the raid based on the evidence I had compiled over the last 6 months. "Special investigator," the agent said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of sympathy for the woman standing in front of him. "The perimeter is secure. The financial targets are in custody. Are we ready to process the primary suspects?" Camilla froze. The words "special investigator" hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization that she was not talking to a helpless victim, but to the very federal authority orchestrating her downfall, completely paralyzed her. "We are almost ready," Agent Trey interjected smoothly, stepping away from the heavy mahogany desk. But there is one final piece of evidence the Bureau needs to officially log into the record before you transport her. Trey walked over to the massive smart television mounted on the far wall of the executive office. It was a high-end display used for corporate presentations, equipped with a row of media ports along the side panel. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out the small silver USB drive. It was the exact same drive he had smuggled into my hospital room on the worst night of my life. "What is that?" Bennett mumbled from his pathetic position on the floor, his eyes wide with a new, undiscovered terror. Trey did not answer him. He plugged the drive into the television and picked up the remote control from the conference table. He switched the input source. The large screen flickered for a second, transitioning from a black void to a crystal-clear high-definition security feed. Camilla let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She recognized the angle immediately. The footage was stamped with the date and time from exactly 6 months ago. It showed the upper private terrace of the Waldorf restaurant. The camera had been positioned perfectly in the corner, capturing the entire stone balustrade and the glowing city skyline in unobstructed detail. The room watched in absolute horrified silence as the digital versions of myself and Camilla walked out onto the terrace. The video had no audio, but the body language screamed the truth. I stood my ground, calm and collected. Camilla was pacing, her gestures aggressive and frantic as she realized I knew about the bank audit. Then the moment of truth played out in vivid color. The video clearly showed Camilla lunging forward. There was no stumble. There was no accidental slip. She planted both of her hands squarely on my chest and pushed with all of her body weight. The sheer violence of the act was undeniable. The camera captured me falling backward over the stone edge, disappearing into the dark void below. But the footage did not stop there. It showed exactly what Camilla did next. She did not panic. She did not immediately run for help. She stood at the edge of the terrace for 5 agonizing seconds, looking down to ensure I had fallen. Then she calmly smoothed her hair, adjusted her expensive silk blouse, and practiced a look of horror before finally turning to run down the stairs to play the victim for the crowd. Paige let out a choked sob, pressing her hands over her mouth. Even Bennett looked away, physically sickened by the undeniable visual proof of his mother's cruelty. Trey paused the video on a frame showing Camilla's cold, calculating face as she looked over the ledge. He turned to the federal agents. "As you can see, the financial crimes were only the motive. That is the primary offense." The lead special agent stepped forward, reaching to his belt to unclip a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. He walked directly up to Camilla, who was trembling so violently she could barely stand. "Camilla, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and the attempted murder of a federal investigator," the agent stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The cold click of the handcuffs finalizing Camilla's arrest was completely drowned out by the heavy mahogany door bursting open. Kelsey rushed into the executive office. Her face was flushed, her makeup ruined by fresh tears, and her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had clearly pushed her way past the hotel security and the remaining federal agents in the corridor. She stopped dead in her tracks the moment she crossed the threshold. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the absolute chaos. She saw the corrupt police chief being hauled away down the hall. She saw her brother Bennett curled into a pathetic ball on the floor. And then she saw her mother. The untouchable matriarch of their elite family was kneeling on the oriental rug in a torn emerald gown, her wrists bound tightly behind her back by federal steel. "Mom," Kelsey gasped, taking a hesitant step forward. "What is happening? What did they do to you?" Camilla immediately seized the opportunity. The desperate, cornered criminal vanished, replaced by the manipulative, weeping mother playing her final card. "Kelsey, thank God," Camilla cried out, straining against the agent's grip. "You have to stop him. Trey has lost his mind. He is trying to destroy our family. He brought these federal agents here based on vicious lies Sloan fabricated. Tell your husband to call this off right now." Kelsey turned her head, looking at Trey. He stood tall and unmoving next to me, his face a mask of absolute professional composure. He did not look angry, but he did not look forgiving either. He was waiting. This was the defining moment of their marriage. Trey. What are you doing? Kelsey pleaded, her voice trembling. She is my mother. Please, whatever this is, we can handle it privately. You cannot let them take her away. Trey did not answer her. He did not have to. He simply raised his hand and pointed a single finger toward the massive smart television mounted on the wall. Kelsey followed his gesture. The screen was still frozen on the high-definition security footage from the Waldorf terrace. It showed her mother, her elegant, refined mother, leaning forward with her hands violently shoved against my chest. It showed me falling backward into the dark abyss. Kelsey stared at the screen. The color drained completely from her face. She took a slow, unsteady step closer to the television, as if getting closer would somehow change the undeniable truth displayed in front of her. "That is a fake!" Camilla shrieked from the floor, her voice cracking with desperation. "Sloan manufactured that video to frame me. You know she is unstable, Kelsey. You know she blamed me for her miscarriage. You cannot believe her over your own mother." Kelsey slowly turned her head away from the screen and looked directly at me. She remembered the hospital. She remembered bringing me flowers, believing the lies her mother and brother had spun about my mental breakdown and accidental fall. She looked at my healthy posture now, the tailored crimson suit, the federal badge clipped to my blazer. The cognitive dissonance shattered. She finally saw the terrifying reality of the woman who raised her. "You pushed her?" Kelsey whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried the devastating weight of total heartbreak. "You actually pushed her off that roof." "Kelsey, please," Camilla begged, dropping her head forward. "I did it for us. I did it to protect your inheritance, to protect the family legacy. You have to understand. Make Trey help me." Kelsey looked at her mother. The woman she had worshipped and feared her entire life was suddenly reduced to nothing but a violent, greedy fraud. Kelsey did not yell. She did not throw a tantrum. She simply took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and took 3 deliberate steps backward. She moved away from her mother and walked directly over to Trey. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers tightly through his. She chose her husband. She chose the truth. "I have nothing to say to you," Kelsey said coldly, looking down at her mother. "Let the agents do their job." Camilla let out a final agonizing wail of defeat. She had lost her money, her freedom, and now her only remaining loyal child. The lead special agent hauled Camilla to her feet without a shred of gentleness and began marching her toward the door. Before they could exit, the doorway was suddenly blocked again. Paige, the billionaire heiress who had quietly slipped out of the room during the chaos to make a private phone call, stormed back into the executive office. She was no longer the confused, terrified bride-to-be. She was furious. She held the black leather folder of financial evidence high in the air, her eyes burning with a fiery rage as she locked her gaze entirely on Bennett. Paige marched across the room, the heels of her designer shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor bordering the oriental rug. She did not look at Camilla, who was still being held tightly by the federal agents. She did not look at Trey or me. Her entire focus was zeroed in on the cowardly man still cowering on the floor. Bennett scrambled to his feet as she approached. He hastily wiped the tears and sweat from his face, desperately trying to salvage whatever dignity he thought he had left. He reached his hands out toward her in a pleading gesture, his custom velvet dinner jacket wrinkled and covered in lint from the rug. "Paige, please listen to me," Bennett stammered. His voice was shaky and breathless. "You have to let me explain everything. I did not want any of this to happen. I am a victim here too. My mother controlled everything in this family. She made me do it. She told me if I did not go along with her plan, we would lose the estate, and I would have absolutely nothing to offer you. I loved you too much to let that happen." Paige stopped 2 feet in front of him. She did not soften. She did not look sympathetic. She looked at him with the cold, calculating eyes of a billionaire heiress who had just caught an employee embezzling from her company. She raised the black leather folder and slammed it violently against his chest. Bennett fumbled, his hands shaking as he barely caught the heavy file before it hit the ground. "You did not love me?" Paige said, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You loved my family money. You looked at my dowry and saw a giant eraser for your mother's federal crimes. You stood next to me at the altar of our engagement party, smiling for the cameras, knowing full well that your entire life was funded by stolen money. You are a complete fraud, Bennett. I swear I was going to tell you, Bennett pleaded, taking a desperate step forward. I just needed to secure the marriage first. I was going to fix the accounts quietly. I was going to make it right. You know me, Paige. You know I am a good person. She forced me into a corner. She forced me to divorce Sloane. I had no choice in the matter. Paige let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. A good person, she repeated, shaking her head in total disgust. I just read through 10 years of fraudulent ledgers. I just listened to you admit that you knew your mother pushed your pregnant wife off a balcony, and your only concern was protecting your monthly allowance. You are not a victim of your mother's manipulation, Bennett. You are just a lazy, spineless coward who was perfectly happy to let women bleed so you could keep driving imported cars. Bennett reached out and grabbed her wrist. Paige, please. The wedding is in 2 months. The press is already out there in the lobby. If you walk away now, it will be a massive scandal for your family, too. We can spin this. We can hire crisis managers to handle the optics. The moment his fingers wrapped around her wrist, Paige's eyes darkened with pure fury. She ripped her arm out of his grasp with violent force. Then she raised her right hand and slapped him directly across the face. The sound of the slap was incredibly loud, ringing through the private executive office like a gunshot. It was not a polite, dramatic society slap. It was a heavy, full-force strike fueled by the realization that she had almost bound her entire life to a monster. The physical impact snapped Bennett's head to the side. He stumbled backward, completely losing his footing, and crashed hard into the edge of the heavy conference table. You do not get to worry about my family reputation ever again, Paige commanded, stepping over him as he cowered against the wood. You are not a victim, Bennett. You are broke, and the wedding is officially off. She reached down to her left hand and grabbed the massive multi-million-dollar diamond engagement ring he had placed on her finger just 3 hours ago. She pulled it off smoothly and threw it directly at his face. The heavy ring hit his chest and bounced off, rolling away into the dark shadows beneath the conference table. Paige did not wait for a response. She turned her back on him, walked straight past the federal agents and Camilla, and marched out of the room with her head held high. She was escaping the sinking ship, taking the final lifeline Bennett had desperately clung to. The door clicked shut behind her. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Bennett remained on the floor, his hand pressed against his rapidly swelling red cheek. He looked at the empty space where his wealthy fiancée had just stood. He looked at his mother, who was being hauled out the door by the FBI agents, completely unable to save him. He had nothing left. His money was frozen. His social status was obliterated. His future was entirely destroyed. Slowly, Bennett turned his head and looked at me. The pathetic weeping coward vanished entirely. As the absolute finality of his financial ruin settled into his brain, his despair mutated into a vicious, ugly rage. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He bared his teeth in a wild snarl, staring at me like a cornered animal preparing to strike. He thought he was completely out of options, but his twisted mind suddenly grabbed onto one final pathetic card. You think you won? Bennett spat, his chest heaving as he pushed himself away from the edge of the mahogany table. The sharp red handprint from Paige's slap was still glowing angrily across his cheek. You think you walked in here, ruined my gala, and destroyed my life? And that makes you the ultimate victor. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed terribly in the empty space of the executive office. It was the sound of a man whose mind was frantically trying to reject his own destruction. But you played yourself, Sloane. You overplayed your hand entirely. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, watching him unravel. Is that so? Yes, Bennett shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You signed those divorce papers 6 months ago. I watched you do it. You signed away your rights to alimony. You signed away your rights to the Connecticut estate. You walked out of my house with a single canvas duffel bag and a cheap settlement check. You might have sent my mother to federal prison today, and you might have ruined my wedding, but guess what? I am still a free man. He took a step forward, desperately trying to physically intimidate me, puffing out his chest under his ruined velvet dinner jacket. The federal government froze the accounts because my mother was the trustee. But those freeze orders will eventually lift when the criminal investigation concludes. And when the dust finally settles, I am still the sole legal beneficiary of my grandfather's trust. Whatever is left in there, the remaining $2 million, the commercial real estate portfolio, the mansion, it all legally defaults to me. I will sell the house. I will rebuild my wealth. I will find another woman from my own social class. And you will still be a miserable, lonely auditor living in a cramped apartment entirely forgotten by the world. He finished his rant, breathing heavily through his nose, waiting for me to break. He wanted to see me cry. He wanted to see the realization wash over my face that my grand plan for revenge had ultimately left me with nothing. I raised my left arm and casually checked the time on my sleek silver watch. I let a long, suffocating silence stretch between us before I finally responded. "Are you quite finished?" I asked. My voice was perfectly flat and completely devoid of emotion. "You are right about one thing, Bennett. The divorce was officially finalized by a judge last week. I am no longer legally bound to you or your massive, suffocating debts. But you clearly never bothered to actually read the dense legal bylaws of your own grandfather's trust." Bennett frowned. His arrogant sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. "I know the bylaws. The money belongs to me." "The money was designed to eventually belong to you," I corrected him smoothly. "The trust explicitly stipulates that the funds remain under the strict control of the appointed trustee until you produce a biological heir. That was the only trigger that would dissolve the trust and grant you direct access to the principal balance." "And I did not produce an heir," Bennett snapped back, his voice dripping with sudden vicious cruelty. "You lost the baby Sloane. You fell off a roof and miscarried. There is no heir. Therefore, the trust remains intact. Since my mother is going to federal prison, the bank will simply appoint an independent fiduciary to manage my money. That is how the law works." "That is how the law works when the facts align with your fabricated reality," Trey interjected. He stepped up beside me, slipping his hands into his suit pockets. "But your entire reality is based on a lie your mother created to save her own skin, a lie you happily repeated to the police." Bennett looked back and forth between Trey and me. The color slowly began to drain from his face once again as a new, entirely different kind of panic started to set in. "What are you talking about?" "Your grandfather was a brilliant, meticulous man," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "He knew that unearned wealth could easily corrupt a person, so he built a permanent fail-safe into the legal framework of the trust. A strict morality and criminality clause. If the acting trustee commits a felony in the execution of their duties and the primary beneficiary is found to be complicit in that felony, they immediately forfeit their rights to the estate." Bennett's eyes widened in horror. "I was not complicit. I did not steal the money. I just found out about it. You admitted on a recorded phone line in front of federal agents that you knew about the massive embezzlement for years and helped conceal it to protect your lifestyle," Trey reminded him coldly. "That makes you an accessory after the fact to federal wire fraud. You are legally disqualified from inheriting a single cent." "Even if that is true," Bennett stammered, backing away until his shoulders hit the wall. "If I am disqualified, the trust dissolves entirely and the assets go to charity. You still get nothing. You still lose." I let a genuine, radiant smile spread across my face. It was the first real smile I had directed at him in 6 months. "The trust only defaults to charity if there is no next of kin to inherit the estate." Right on cue, the heavy mahogany door of the executive office swung open one last time. A woman in a crisp professional uniform stepped quietly into the room. It was the private nanny I had hired a month ago, and resting securely in her arms, wrapped in a soft blue cashmere blanket, was a beautiful, perfectly healthy 6-month-old baby boy. He was wide awake, looking around the room with bright, curious eyes. The absolute silence in the room became so heavy, it felt difficult to breathe. The private nanny, dressed in a crisp navy uniform, paused just inside the doorway. She held Leo securely against her chest. He was wide awake, his bright eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, completely unaware that his mere existence was actively dismantling a $50 million empire. I walked across the oriental rug, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I reached out and gently took my son from the nanny. She gave a small, respectful nod and stepped back out into the corridor, closing the heavy mahogany door behind her. The familiar warm weight of him against my chest instantly grounded me. I adjusted the soft blue cashmere blanket, making sure he was comfortable before turning back to face the room. Camilla, still firmly restrained by the lead special agent near the door, stared at the baby. Her eyes bulged, and her mouth opened and closed, like a fish suffocating on dry land. A sharp wheezing gasp escaped her throat. She began to hyperventilate. The rapid, ragged breaths echoed loudly in the quiet office. She stared at the child she had tried to murder. She realized in that agonizing moment that her violent shove on the Waldorf terrace had not stopped the clock. It had only accelerated her own destruction. The baby survived. The heir was born. The bank audit was triggered. She had destroyed her entire life for absolutely nothing. No. Camilla gasped, shaking her head violently from side to side. Her knees buckled again, forcing the two federal agents to physically haul her up by her arms to keep her standing. "That is impossible. You fell. There was so much blood. It cannot be him." I ignored her completely. She was no longer my problem. She belonged to the federal justice system now. I focused my attention entirely on the man cowering near the heavy mahogany conference table. Bennett stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the small face peeking out from the blue blanket. He looked at Leo's wispy hair, his small button nose, and the unmistakable shape of his eyes. There was no denying the biology. The resemblance was undeniable. "Bennett," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the room. "I want you to meet your son. The one you told the police I hallucinated. The one you gladly signed away to protect your monthly allowance. His name is Leo, because he survived everything your family tried to do to him." Bennett swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down in his throat. He took a slow, unsteady step forward. His mind was clearly racing frantically, trying to process the massive legal and financial implications of the child in my arms. He remembered the morality and criminality clause Trey had just explained. If Bennett was complicit in the fraud, he forfeited his right to the estate. But if the baby was his biological heir, the baby inherited everything. In Bennett's twisted, greedy mind, he suddenly saw a massive legal loophole. He saw a lifeline. He thought he could use his status as a father to regain access to the immense wealth. Sloan Bennett whispered, his voice trembling, as he took another step closer. He tried to quickly plaster a look of overwhelming paternal love onto his face, but it looked incredibly forced and sickeningly transparent. "You had the baby, my son. You kept him a secret from me all this time. I am a father." He continued to inch forward completely, ignoring the federal agent standing by the door, ignoring his mother sobbing hysterically, and ignoring the ruined gala waiting out in the lobby. He was fixated entirely on the child, or rather the $50 million trust fund the child now legally represented. "We can fix this," Bennett pleaded, holding his hands up in a placating, desperate gesture. "We are a family, you and me and Leo. We do not need the police, we do not need the courts. I will testify against my mother. I will tell them everything she did. Just do not take him away from me. I am his father. I have rights to him. We can raise him together in the Connecticut house. It is our house now." The absolute audacity of his words made my blood run cold. After abandoning me in a hospital bed, after lying to the police to cover up an attempted murder, after admitting he knew his mother tried to kill us, he still thought he could manipulate his way back into my life for a paycheck. He actually thought he could lay claim to my son. Bennett took a final, eager step forward, raising his right hand. He reached out his trembling fingers, extending toward the soft blue cashmere blanket, intending to touch Leo's face. He never even came close. Trey moved with explosive speed. He stepped forcefully between us, his broad shoulders completely blocking Bennett's path. Trey did not just stand there. He shoved Bennett hard in the center of his chest, sending him stumbling backward. Bennett crashed backward into the heavy mahogany table, sending a stack of hotel menus and a crystal water pitcher scattering across the hardwood floor. He gripped his chest, looking up at Trey with a mix of breathless shock and indignant fury. "You cannot keep me from him," Bennett sputtered, scrambling frantically to regain his footing. "I have a legal right to my child. I will hire a fleet of lawyers. I will drag you through family court until you are bankrupt, Sloan. I am still a Vanderbilt. I still have the trust. Do not ever try to touch them again," Trey warned, his voice dropping to a lethal vibrating baritone that commanded the entire room. "You lost the right to play the devoted family man the night you left your wife bleeding in a hospital bed to go drink scotch with your mother." Bennett shook his head, his breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. "No. A judge will see I was coerced into the divorce. I am the primary beneficiary. I have the resources to fight this." Trey let out a sharp, cold laugh. He snapped his briefcase open on the table and pulled out a single stark white legal folder. "You really are incapable of listening to reality, Bennett. Let me break down the exact mechanics of your legal annihilation." Trey held up the documents, pointing to the federal seals. "Here is exactly how the law works. The trustee felony. Camilla committed federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and attempted murder while acting as the primary fiduciary of the estate. And the accomplice forfeiture. You, by your own recorded confession broadcast in this very room, actively concealed her crimes to protect your allowance. Under the grandfather trust's strict morality clause, any beneficiary complicit in a felony against the estate instantly forfeits all legal claims." The succession line. The moment you were legally disqualified by your own admission, the entire estate automatically bypassed you and transferred to the next surviving biological heir. Trey pointed directly at the baby wrapped securely in my arms. "The heir is Leo. He is the sole undisputed beneficiary of the $50 million grandfather trust. He is an infant," Bennett stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "He cannot manage an estate. The bank will appoint a conservator. I will petition the court to manage his assets. I am his father." I stepped forward, looking down at my pathetic ex-husband. "You will do absolutely nothing," I told him, my voice completely devoid of pity. "When you forced me to sign those divorce papers, you demanded a clause stating there were no children born of our marriage. You legally severed all paternal rights. You erased yourself from his birth certificate to protect yourself from paying child support. I am his sole legal guardian." I let the devastating reality of my words sink into his shallow, greedy mind. Under federal estate law, as the sole legal guardian of the primary beneficiary, I am now the ultimate controller of the trust. I control the remaining liquid assets. I control the commercial real estate portfolio. I control the holding companies. I own it all, Bennett. Every single thing your mother tried to kill me to protect now legally belongs to me." By the door, Camilla let out a guttural, agonizing shriek. The federal agents tightened their grip on her arms as she thrashed wildly, driven mad by the realization that her precious family legacy was now entirely in the hands of the working-class woman she despised. Her absolute worst nightmare had just become her permanent reality. Bennett's jaw went slack. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, empty shell. He turned to his mother, but she was completely broken, weeping uncontrollably in federal steel. She could not save him. No one could save him. 6 months ago, I continued, my tone sharp as shattered glass. "You stood in the hallway of the Connecticut estate and watched security guards march me out the front door. You gave me a canvas duffel bag and told me I had 10 minutes to leave your property." Trey pulled one final piece of paper from his white folder. He stepped forward and slapped the document flat against Bennett's chest. "This is a formal court-ordered notice of eviction," Trey stated clinically. "Since the Connecticut mansion is an asset of the trust and Sloan now controls the trust, she is officially your landlord, and she is terminating your residency. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises." Bennett stared blindly at the eviction notice in his trembling hands. The paper shook violently. If he did not leave the massive estate by tomorrow afternoon, the local police would physically drag him out the front doors and toss him onto the public road. He had no money, no fiancé, no family legacy, and absolutely nowhere to go. He was officially homeless. The lead special agent finally lost the last shred of his professional patience. He gave a sharp, decisive nod to his partner. Together, the two massive federal agents hauled Camilla entirely off the oriental rug. She kicked wildly, her expensive designer heels scuffing against the polished hardwood floor, but her resistance was completely futile against their sheer physical strength. Sloane. Camilla screamed, her voice tearing from her throat in a ragged, feral shriek. You planned this! You set me up! You ruined my family! They dragged her backward toward the heavy mahogany door. The elegant emerald gown she had worn to celebrate her financial salvation was now a torn, wrinkled mess. I will destroy you! Camilla wailed, her head thrashing, as the agents forced her through the doorway and out into the hotel corridor. You are nothing but a common gold digger. Sloane. Her frantic, hysterical screaming echoed down the hallway, growing fainter and fainter as they marched her toward the service elevators. The sound eventually faded into the distance, leaving the executive office engulfed in a heavy, suffocating silence. The matriarch of the empire was gone, headed straight for a concrete cell. Bennett stared at the empty doorway. The absolute finality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining pillars of his sanity. His legs gave out completely. He dropped to his knees on the oriental rug, the formal eviction notice crumpling violently in his clenched fists. He did not just cry. He openly sobbed. His shoulders heaved with heavy, pathetic gasps as he crawled forward, closing the distance between us until he was kneeling directly at my feet. Sloane, please! Bennett begged, his voice completely wrecked by desperation. He reached out with shaking hands, desperately wanting to grab the hem of my crimson blazer, but he remembered Trey standing right beside me and wisely kept his hands hovering in the air. You cannot do this to me! Bennett wept, tears and snot running freely down his face. I have absolutely nowhere to go. My credit cards are frozen. My friends will abandon me the second they see the news. I cannot survive on the streets. Please, Sloane, give me a second chance. Give me a month in the house to figure things out. I can be a good husband. I can be a real father to Leo. Just let me be part of my son's life. Do not take my home away. I looked down at the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. I searched my heart for even a microscopic trace of sympathy, a single ounce of pity for the agonizing pain he was experiencing. I found absolutely nothing. He was a stranger to me now. He was just a cowardly accomplice who had traded my life for a monthly allowance. I shifted my weight and gently adjusted the soft blue cashmere blanket wrapped around my son. Leo shifted in his sleep, completely undisturbed by the pathetic groveling of the man kneeling on the floor. When I first married into this family, I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. Your mother told everyone I faked a pregnancy to trap you for a $50 million payout. She told the police I was a hysterical, manipulative liar. Bennett looked up at me through his tears, his face red and swollen, clinging to every word I said, in the desperate hope that I was about to offer him a lifeline. They were all wrong, I told him, looking directly into his terrified eyes. I never cared about the money. I never cared about the social status. I just wanted a family. I let a slow, freezing smile touch my lips. But taking your empire is a nice bonus. I turned my back on him. I did not say another word. I did not need to. His punishment was already absolute. Let us go, Trey, I said. Trey gave a firm nod. He adjusted his suit jacket, picked up his leather briefcase, and opened the heavy mahogany door for me. We walked out of the executive office, leaving Bennett sobbing alone on the floor with his eviction notice. We stepped back into the grand ballroom. The space was completely unrecognizable. The elite socialites had scattered like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The string quartet was gone. The catering staff was hurriedly clearing away the vintage champagne and beluga caviar. The gilded wonderland Camilla had built was nothing more than a hollow, abandoned crime scene. We walked across the polished marble floor and headed straight for the main lobby. The heavy glass doors of the Pierre Hotel loomed ahead. Word of the massive FBI raid had already leaked to the press. Through the glass, I could see a massive barricade of reporters, camera crews, and aggressive paparazzi waiting on the chilly Manhattan sidewalk. They were hungry for the story of the decade, the fall of an American dynasty. Trey pushed the heavy glass doors open. The cold night air hit my face immediately, followed by the blinding rapid-fire explosions of hundreds of camera flashes. Reporters shouted my name, shoving microphones over the velvet ropes, desperate for a statement. I did not flinch. I did not hide my face. I held my son securely against my chest, my head held high, my tailored crimson suit glowing under the relentless barrage of flashing lights. A sleek black Federal Transport SUV was idling at the curb, its rear door already held open by an agent. Trey guided me through the chaotic sea of journalists, acting as a perfect impenetrable shield. I stepped into the warm leather interior of the vehicle and settled into the seat. Trey climbed in right beside me and pulled the heavy door shut instantly, muting the frantic screams of the press. The driver put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the busy Manhattan traffic. I looked down at Leo. He was wide awake now, looking up at me with bright, innocent eyes. We were safe. We were wealthy beyond measure, and we were entirely free. As the black SUV sped away from the hotel, leaving the ruined legacy of my cowardly ex-husband completely in the dust, I never once looked back. The stunning downfall of this corrupt family reveals a profound reality. Unearned privilege and ruthless manipulation are incredibly fragile when finally confronted with patience and meticulous facts. Sloane did not win by matching the frantic screaming or cowardice of her abusers. She triumphed through silent endurance and unshakable evidence. When wronged by toxic people, your greatest weapon is rarely immediate retaliation. It is the disciplined accumulation of undeniable truth. True strength requires remaining perfectly composed while arrogant adversaries dig their own inevitable graves. Stand firm in your truth and refuse to let toxic environments dictate your ultimate personal worth today.